everybody, this is the Wikstrand. So, Citizen Kane, a legendary film that is so beloved and so legendary that if you just say its name to a film buff of any description, they're just going to start beaming with joy and they will just not shut the fuck up how fucking amazing this is. One of the greatest movies of all time. It's called way ahead of its time, they say, and it is a legendary movie, you know, of which there are just a handful of movies that can compete with. But if you would just ask, you know, your regular local yokel down at the supermarket, Citizen Kane, you would say, and they would say, what? They had no idea what you're talking about. They might have, you know, some vague concept that this is some kind of, you know, this super duper legendary movie, but I would guess that most of them have, you know, not seen it, unless they, you know, are a member of an older generation thing. But the thing is that it took me quite a while before I actually saw this movie the first time. I think it was around 2006 or 2007, or, you know, in that ballpark. And to tell you the truth, I wasn't that impressed with the whole thing because the big reveal in the end was kind of spoiled in the oddest way possible. You wanna know who spoiled the ending for me? The real Ghostbusters. That's right. The real Ghostbusters made me sit there when I watched Citizen Kane the first time and say to myself, well, I know how this thing is going to end and I know what all of this thing means and will mean in the end. And sure enough, that was actually exactly what happened. So I was of the opinion that it was just a little bit overrated. So it took me a long time to rewatch Citizen Kane. It actually took me right up until last week to rewatch this movie. And what did I think about it when I rewatched it? Well, it was a whole lot fucking better. I'm gonna tell you that one for free. But let's find out how great Citizen Kane is. If it is a movie that you should see, well, you should see it. It's almost an obligation to have seen Citizen Kane at least once. But will you like it? That's what we're gonna find out today. This is Citizen Kane. In Florida, in a gigantic monstrosity of a colossal building, there is an old man that is, you know, walking around among all the things that he has gathered throughout a very, very special life, statues and fantastic works of art and things like that, and he is about to die. And he goes out with one word that utters his mouth before he dies, and the snow globe falls to the floor and breaks. Rosebud. And then we are informed, you know, who Charles Foster Kane was in this sort of newsreel obituary thing that is being produced. It's a very, very exposition heavy but incredibly fascinating look at a man's life. But then they're trying to figure out how to wrap this thing up. Rosebud? What was Rosebud? Who was Rosebud? So we have this journalist called Leland who gets the task of trying to find out who Rosebud was. And he goes sort of, you know, back in time and meets up with people who knew Kane and who, you know, interacted with him throughout the years to try to find out more about Kane and who Rosebud was. And that is how this movie is structured. We have, you know, flashbacks that gradually brings us from the start of his life to the very end when he's left all alone in Xanadu, decreed by Kublai Khan. Sorry, couldn't help it. Thanks for that one rush. And that is essentially what this movie is. Now, I'm going to say this. I love how this movie is structured, and I would bet you that a Martin Scorsese has probably seen this movie hundreds of times and probably inspired him at, you know, crafting these big epics that he would be known for later in his career. Because that is what this is. This is a big epic about a mystery that is slowly unraveled before our eyes with an absolutely magnetic Orson Welles in the titular character of Charles Foster Kane. A very complex man who seems to have a big ego and wants to be loved, but always seems to be missing something, and is incapable of really loving anybody back, and he screws over his partners, and he, you know, lies to people, and he has this inflated perception of himself, and he ultimately builds this, you know, monstrosity complex, Xanadu, in Florida. And by the way, Florida back in those days wasn't, you know, the golf and senior citizen resort that it is today. It was basically a swamp at the time, if I have understood things correctly. But this movie is so fascinating, and it is so well played, and it is so ahead of its time, because it is an absolute technical masterpiece. Some shots in this movie, I have no idea how they did it. They probably invented half a dozen techniques that we today take for granted, but at this point was totally groundbreaking. And everything leads, of course, up to the fantastic ending, which ties everything together, and we find out who Rosebud actually was and why it meant so much to Kane. And the longer I saw this movie when I rewatched it, the more I understood. And the longer I watched this movie, the more I kept thinking, man, if they would ever have done a, you know, remake of it, I'm not advocating to do a remake of anything, but if they would do a remake, the only man who could have done it would probably be Martin Scorsese. And especially in the later years of Kane's life, I can just see Leonardo DiCaprio playing him with, you know, his thing, and, you know, chewing the scenery and doing all this stuff that Kane does. And 2 hours, by the way, flies by, considering how old this movie is. This movie has a pretty damn excellent pace. There are a few occasions where things slows down, and there is a couple of sequences, especially though the opera thing that comes in the third act, which I didn't think, you know, added that much to the story overall, and, you know, took up a little too much of this movie's plot. I thought it was other things, especially the political bits, that I thought could have been explored more, but they are there, and I guess they are necessary. And Kane himself is just such a fascinating character. He's just so complex, and the more you get to know him, the less you understand where this thing is going and why he's doing all these things that he's doing, even though it becomes very, very clear in the end. And in my opinion, I think it may not be one of the greatest movies of all time, but by far one of the greatest movies that was done in the 1940s, even though, you know, there are movies made around the same time, which I think was, you know, stronger, like The Maltese Falcon and Casablanca, for instance, but that's a story for another time. So, should you see a movie like Citizen Kane? Well, if you have never seen it, you have to see it, because it is a part of our cultural history. Not everybody will like this movie. Some people will just watch it and say, well, this is just some, you know, old black and white movie about some rich asshole that feels a bit like a Martin Scorsese movie, but without, you know, the profanity and the cursing and the drugs and Margot Robbie's tits and stuff like that. So the thing is that some people will just see this as a slow-moving movie that is, you know, overrated and too old for its own good, and can't see, you know, the brilliance of the technical aspects of the whole thing, and how the movie is structured, and the complex characters, and how they interact with each other, and how, you know, the movie slowly unravels. And I can understand that, I can accept the fact that people will not really get the point of this movie. But no matter how good this movie is, you can still see sort of the limitations that Orson Welles was struggling with. He cannot quite get that amazing movie that I guess he wanted to do off the ground. There are, you know, aspects of it that looks a little bit dated, and you can see, well, there are certain sequences in this movie where you get the sense that, well, Orson Welles couldn't quite get the shot he wanted to. He couldn't quite get the visual representation that he wanted to, because of either budgetary or technical limitations. But this is a movie that holds up remarkably well, and as I said, was a whole lot better when I saw it the second time than the first time. And I also discovered a whole lot of fascinating small little details that I didn't know. Now, the backstory of the movie Citizen Kane is almost as fascinating as the movie itself, and helps solidify its legendary status, which it actually is worthy of. And if you have never seen this movie, do see it. Some people will love it, some people will hate it, some people will be indifferent to it, but you cannot deny one thing. You cannot deny that you will probably be quite hooked from the start, and you will then not be able to look away until the movie is ending, and then you will say, wow, that was really something, and some will just scratch their head and say, what the fuck was that? But I am of the opinion that this is a very, very, very good movie that is almost as good as the film buffs will say it is. Almost, but not quite, but it is very, very, very close. A technical marvel, way ahead of its time, with a fantastic Orson Welles and a fascinating story. Citizen Kane gets 84 points. I wish that some parts of it could have been cut or trimmed, and there are some bits that could have been explored more, and you also get the feeling that 2 hours is a little bit too little actually to explore the story that is kind of alluded to, and sometimes things are a little bit rushed and sometimes things takes a little bit too long time. But overall, I think this is a fantastic movie that everybody should have seen at least once. So what do you think about Citizen Kane? Comment below, and I'll see you next time from, well, so-and-so reviewing, well, such and such. Thank you for watching. Thank you very much.